meet my bride. Let's go for a ride in my newfangled automobile. Just where we will go, nobody knows, but it's sure a great way to feel. Behind the wheel of the speed meter steel, it's my newfangled automobile.
Hello and welcome to Vintage Car History. I'm Wild Bill. Here is a classic father and son project, making a go-kart. You buy a used rundown lawnmower or such at a garage sale, take out the engine and use it to power a small death-dealing motor vehicle for your son to ride at unsafe speeds and probably hurt himself badly in the process. Hopefully mom wasn't watching. The truth is that many car manufacturers of the vintage era did much the same thing. They got their hands on an engine and slapped something together that would somehow roll. But just having an engine and an idea, or even a frame of some kind to mount it on, wasn't enough. The power from that engine has to turn wheels on the vehicle, or else all it will do is make a lot of smoke and noise. Thus, some kind of drive chain, a transmission, clutch, perhaps a differential, or something has to be part of the equation as well. Well, in the go-karts of my youth, this was a fun thing to figure out. And back in the early days of the car, it was even less figured out. How do you deliver power to the ground? Well, let's take a look at how what we all know as the drive chain that's behind the engine came about. The very first transmission on a road-going motor vehicle was, of course, designed and built by Nicolas Cugnot in 1769. The first episode of this channel is all about his gun tractor and has quite a bit of detail about how he pulled it off. His vehicle was a three-wheeled monster. One wheel in front and two wheels in back, with the front wheel being both the drive wheel and the steering point. Yeah, the first road machine was front-wheel drive. The engine provided the linear power and, through a transmission that was based on the same principles found in a clock, pushed the wheel through a ratchet system. There were no gears involved as we think of them today. The transmission could allow either forward or reverse power to the wheel. No changing gears or speeds. Top speed of the thing was about 2 miles an hour. As ingenious as this was, it was not particularly efficient or easy to maneuver for that matter. And it was another 40 plus years before someone tried again, this time by Richard Trevithick. He solved the problem by simply not having a transmission. The high-pressure steam engine he devised could go from a complete rest to full power almost instantly, so he attached the piston rods directly to the wheels. He just added the needed joints and knuckles to keep the piston and wheel talking to each other. This is the basic method that was exploited on locomotives for the next 150 years or so, and is still, in principle, used on diesel-electric trains of today. But doing that on a road-going coach was not feasible. Trevithick did try it, but he ran into some serious problems. First was that his engine was too powerful. An engine that can produce full power and torque right the freak now also has the power to simply rip the wheels right off of the vehicle. This is considered a bad thing amongst engineers. So if you're going to bolt the steam piston directly to the wheel, that wheel has to be massively built along with the axle and frame that holds everything together. Which leads to the next problem. Wheels and axles that weigh nearly 1,000 pounds apiece are far beyond what any road anywhere can handle. Even the best maintained roads of the early 19th century would become so rutted as to be unnavigable after but a few seasons. But using steel rails to make roads was common practice in various mining operations to move heavy carts full of ore. All that was needed was to build such roads across the countryside that could support such a heavy wheel and vehicle. Thus, the railroad was born. Now, it is true that Richard Trevithick himself did not continue pursuing steam coaches for much longer. Rather, he focused on railroads and mining machinery. But others did, and for the first half of the 19th century, there was a bit of a craze in Europe over making viable and hopefully profitable steam coach lines that could operate on existing roads without destroying them. This meant that the power of the steam engine needed to be harnessed in such a way that the overall weight of the coach and the impact of the wheels on the road could be manageable. And thus began the road to create a true drive chain. And boy, did folks try some crazy things to get a coach moving. One idea was to keep the coach from tearing up the roads was proposed and built in England by a Mr. David Gordon. Make a stout and wide wheels, but not use them to drive the vehicle. Instead, connect the engine to a transom framework that had articulated metal legs and feet, and have them literally run the coach down the road Fred Flintstone style. Yes, this was actually built and put on the road in 1818. A more successful design, also by Mr. Gordon, was to make a steam coach that, although it was a passenger vehicle, was also a steamroller. Yeah, the wheels of this coach absolutely looked like the wheels on the Flintstone car. Well, if you put both of them together, I guess you got the whole Flintstone car, I suppose. But anyway, the roller wheels made the weight distribution to the road acceptable. And at the same time, he did not connect the drive wheel directly to the engine. Rather, his engine drove a large gear, and by simply adding another gear or two, he could reduce the initial wheel braking torque into something much more manageable. True, you couldn't change gears as you can with a modern transmission, but it actually had gears, so at least the road-going drive chain was headed in the right direction. But speed limits now became an issue. Most European nations had speed limits on their roads, and most were also not in the mood to increase them just because some unwieldy iron beast can now ply their nation's roads and do it faster over a long distance than a horse can. Also, these early steam coaches were using the very latest technology and were extremely expensive to produce. They were almost exclusively used as commercial vehicles, either carrying passengers, heavy cargo, and sometimes both. Since the coach has to be slow, under 10 miles an hour in most countries, there was no real need to try to make them faster, so the drive chains of such coaches tended to be simple gear reduction of the engine's direct power strokes. And this was pretty much the case until a London man named Walter Hancock decided to start building coaches with the first chain-driven system. The idea was simple. Put the engine, boiler, and other such across the rear axle and actually drive the wheels through a chain that was driven by a gear from the engine power. This did give better weight distribution at higher speeds, and he built several more coaches refining this concept. But even this advance was still a single-gear direct drive system. As mentioned, steam engines had plenty of power available immediately, so this wasn't really a problem. But when cars, as opposed to coaches, came along, things had to change. Cars are personal vehicles and have smaller engines. Be they steam, gas, or electric, but especially gas, the power plants don't always have the power or flexibility of use to be directly connected to the wheels. A smaller vehicle with the smaller power plant would need new systems to get them moving. And Carl Benz, as well as Gottlieb Daimler, thought about this and came up with some solutions. Both of them mounted their gas engines in their respective cars. But the engine's job was to get a large, heavy flywheel spinning. The kinetic energy was then transferred to the wheels. But unlike steam engines, which can run in either direction and can provide nearly 100% power from rest, gas engines could not be started while engaged to the wheels. And if you did push start them, every time the car stopped, the engine would have to be restarted. This is not exactly convenient, so both inventors devised a clutch and transmission system. In the case of Benz, he used a series of belts and pulleys to act as both transmission and clutch. The flywheel had a belt pulley that in turn drove a shaft. A sliding idler pulley acted as both clutch and gear shift. The driver had a lever which could release tension from the belt, allowing the engine to run without driving the wheels. Or the driver could engage the belt onto one of the two available drive pulleys, one for low speed and one for high speed. The shaft that drives the pulley spun had sprockets on either end, which in turn drove the wheels through chains. Daimler did things a bit differently. His car's engine was a bit more powerful than Benz's, so he used a smaller flywheel. The clutch system was about the same as Benz. The shaft supported the flywheel, also had belt pulleys with an idler which would allow the car to have a low and high speed. Instead of chains, Daimler had the belt system drive a shaft that held sprockets, and the sprockets drove the rear wheels via ring gears. And for the next half a dozen years or so, this was pretty much the drive chain options that were available. It was Panhard and Levasseur who would change that forever. They placed the engine squarely in front of the car. Directly behind the engine was a foot-operated clutch. The clutch was primitive, basically two metal plates with sandpaper glued to them, but it was, and still is, the basic principle behind the dry friction clutches of today. Behind this clutch was a transmission, a real one. Emile Levasseur had, in his workshop, a large metal lathe. This lathe, along with all of the other machines in the shop, was powered by a single engine that drove pulley shafts in the ceiling. But the lathe could be made to spin at different speeds from a single speed pulley power through a system of gears and sliding pinions. And Emile thought to himself, "Self? I could adapt this principle to make a transmission behind that clutch, and it wouldn't need any pulleys or belts." This was a good thing, since belts do have a tendency to wear out rather quickly. And so in 1894, the modern transmission was born. Two shafts of gears are involved. On the main or input shaft, pinion gears can be moved or shifted to align with different pinion gears on this counter or output shaft. As long as you matched up the gears when shifting, which took a bit of practice, you could change gears while still rolling and not have to be concerned about belts slipping and such. Yes, this was also the birth of the term shifting gears. Levasseur's transmission had 3 speeds, 2 forward and 1 reverse. Also, the rear wheel axle was driven from the output shaft of the tranny with a single chain in the center of it, as opposed to having 2 chains driving a wheel each. This first true manual transmission developed by Emile Levasseur is still the basis of just about every transmission in every motor vehicle built even to this day. Though over the next few decades synchromesh would be invented as well as automatic transmissions, they all used the shifting pinion gears to change gears that Emile came up with back in the day. However, the final drive to the wheels once you got past the tranny was still either chains, sprockets, or belts. The reason was fairly simple. As these early cars trundled and bounced down the road, the springing and suspension of the time did not keep the distance from the transmission and rear wheels constant. Although chains and belts could be derailed without certain provocations, they could cope with the ever-changing environment that was happening under the driver's seat. Louis Renault added the final piece to this puzzle. In 1898, he developed his own car. Now, his drive chain was laid out in the Panhard Levasseur pattern. Engine in front, clutch and tranny behind, and then the final drive. But what came after that was revolutionary. Instead of a gear or a pulley, the output shaft of the transmission held a universal joint. A new device he called the drive shaft was attached to this. This shaft was, and still is to this day, a hollow metal tube that has been balanced to spin fast. At the other end of the shaft, another universal joint was mounted and fitted into another invention of his, the differential. His differential wasn't particularly complicated, but it was absolutely groundbreaking. The rear axle was now a single piece of steel connecting directly to the wheel hubs. In the center of the axle, a large and quite stout gear was welded in place, and another, this one attached to the U-joint from the drive shaft, drove the drive axle and got the car rolling. At the same time, he stiffened the suspension to reduce the effect of the flex and bouncing that was going to happen. Also, in mounting the drive shaft to the various U-joints, he used splines. As long as they were lubricated regularly, the splines would ensure that no matter how massive the pothole you hit was, the drive shaft wouldn't come loose and fall off when the car was under severe road stress. By 1900, the basic layout of cars was established: engine, clutch, tranny, and then the final drive. Chains working as the final drive would persist for another decade or so here and there, but by 1910 the drive shaft and differential had supplanted them. For the next 60 years or so, the basic components of a car's drive system invented by Emile Levasseur and Louis Renault were the industry standard. More developments came about during the period before and after World War I, which we'll get into in future episodes. But now we all know how we all first got rolling. Thanks for watching Vintage Car History, and we'll see you next week. Peace.